San Jose, California, 1884. The valley air carried the scent of apricot blossoms and new lumber. A widow arrived from New Haven, Connecticut, carrying trunks, grief, and a plan no one could fully understand. She purchased an 8-room farmhouse on 162 acres and immediately began to build. Not for a season, not for a few years, for 38 years without stopping, until the day she died. The house grew like something organic. Wings sprouted, towers climbed, rooms multiplied behind rooms. Staircases led to ceilings, doors opened onto walls. By the time Sarah Winchester's heart stopped in 1922, the structure contained roughly 160 rooms, 2,000 doors, 10,000 windows, 47 stairways, 47 fireplaces, 13 bathrooms, and 6 kitchens. The original 8 rooms had disappeared somewhere inside, absorbed into a labyrinth that defied architectural logic and resisted simple explanation. Cost estimates vary wildly. Contemporary sources suggest $5.5 million over the decades of construction, well over $100 million in today's currency. Room counts also shift depending on who's counting and what qualifies as a room. Some say 160, others claim 200 or more. The floor plan changed so constantly that no complete blueprint exists. Rooms were built, sealed, demolished, rebuilt. The house was never finished, because finishing was never the point. What drives a woman to build for nearly 4 decades without blueprint or endpoint? The popular story offers seances and spirits, a medium's warning that continuous construction would appease the souls killed by Winchester rifles. Build or die. Never stop or the ghosts will take you. The tale is gothic, irresistible, and incomplete, because beneath the supernatural explanation lies something more complicated and more human. A woman wrestling with grief, guilt, wealth she never asked for, and a fortune built on weapons that killed hundreds of thousands across the American West and beyond. If you enjoy deep investigations into Gilded Age architecture and the families who built it, please like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which house to explore next. Your support makes these detailed stories possible. Thank you for being here. The story starts with inheritance, with a young woman marrying into American industry, with death arriving in waves, and with the question that haunted Sarah Winchester through every room she added, every staircase she commissioned, every door she ordered sealed. How do you live with a fortune built on the dead? Sarah Lockwood Pardee was born in 1839 in New Haven, Connecticut, daughter of a carpenter who built carriages and caskets. The family lived comfortably in a city dominated by Yale University and a growing firearms industry. She received education unusual for women of her era, fluent in 4 languages, accomplished pianist, knowledgeable in mathematics and literature. By New Haven standards, the Pardees occupied respectable middle ground, comfortable, not wealthy, connected, not elite. In September 1862, at age 22, Sarah married William Wirt Winchester, son of Oliver Winchester, owner of the Winchester Repeating Arms Company. The Winchesters represented something the Pardees did not: industrial fortune, political influence, wealth that grew with every rifle sold. Oliver had transformed a failing shirt-making business into one of America's most profitable firearms manufacturers. The Winchester rifle had become synonymous with the American frontier, the gun that won the West, promotional materials boasted. Every expansion westward, every conflict with indigenous nations, every cattle drive and mining camp created demand. Era entered a family whose fortune increased with bloodshed. The arithmetic was blunt. During the Civil War alone, Winchester sold thousands of rifles to Union forces. The Henry rifle, Winchester's earlier model, could fire 16 shots without reloading, a devastating advantage that changed battlefield tactics. After the war, production continued. Settlers pushing into indigenous lands carried Winchester rifles. Buffalo hunters decimating herds carried Winchester rifles. Range wars between cattle barons and homesteaders were fought with Winchester rifles. The company's success depended on violence, displacement, and death on an industrial scale. Whether Sarah wrestled with these contradictions initially is something the archives do not tell us. The early years of her marriage appear conventional by wealthy standards. She and William lived in New Haven near his family. In 1866, she gave birth to a daughter, Annie Pardee Winchester. The child died 6 weeks later of marasmus, a wasting disease modern medicine would likely have prevented. Sarah never had another child. Whether this was choice, medical impossibility, or grief is unrecorded. For 15 years after Annie's death, Sarah remained in New Haven. Then, in March 1881, William died of tuberculosis at age 43. Sarah was 41, twice bereaved, and suddenly wealthy beyond anything her carpenter father could have imagined. William's death triggered an inheritance that made her one of the richest women in America. She received roughly $20 million in assets, over $500 million in today's currency, plus nearly 50% ownership of the Winchester Repeating Arms Company, which generated approximately $1,000 daily in income. $1,000 daily in 1881, roughly $30,000 per day in modern terms, every day, whether she spent it or not. The weight of that fortune broke something, or clarified something. Within months of William's death, Sarah left New Haven permanently. She traveled west, first to visit family, then apparently without specific destination. By 1884, she had settled in San Jose, California, a city far from Connecticut's industrial elite and far from memories. She purchased the 8-room farmhouse and began construction immediately. The hammering would not stop for 38 years. The official story, the one tourists still hear, involves a Boston medium named Adam Coons. According to legend, Sarah consulted him after William's death, desperate for contact with her lost husband and daughter. The medium delivered a message that would shape the rest of her life. The Winchester family was cursed by the spirits of everyone killed by Winchester rifles. Thousands upon thousands of souls, Native Americans, soldiers, settlers, innocents caught in crossfire. They haunted the family. They had taken her child. They had taken her husband, and they would take her unless she acted. The medium's prescription was specific, the story goes. Move west, where the sun sets and spirits gather. Buy a house, begin building, and never stop. As long as construction continued, the spirits would be confused, distracted, appeased. The moment hammering ceased, they would find her, and she would die. Build or die. Never stop. Never finish. Spend the blood money on something that could never be completed, an eternal penance constructed in wood and nails. It is a perfect Gothic tale. It is also likely exaggerated, if not entirely invented. No contemporary documentation confirms Sarah ever visited Adam Coons. The first mention of a medium appears decades after Sarah's death in promotional materials designed to attract tourists to the house. The story proved irresistible. Haunted widow builds maze to confuse ghosts, and it has dominated the property's narrative ever since. But strip away the seance and something harder remains. Sarah Winchester inherited a fortune built on weapons that killed hundreds of thousands. The Winchester rifle enabled the near extermination of buffalo herds, the displacement and slaughter of indigenous peoples, and countless individual murders and executions across the American West. Whether Sarah believed in literal spirits or not, the moral weight was real. The money flowing into her accounts daily came from death. That fact required no medium to understand. What she did with that knowledge was unusual. She did not spend lavishly on jewels or yachts or European estates like other Gilded Age heiresses. She did not marry again or pursue high society. She turned the fortune inward, into an architectural project that consumed resources without producing anything saleable. A house that generated no income, housed no dynasty, proved no social position. Just endless construction, endless expenditure, endless transformation of blood money into something else, though what exactly remained unclear even to Sarah herself. The skeptical view is simpler. Sarah was an eccentric widow with too much money and too much grief, indulging in the one activity that gave her control and purpose, building. The spiritualism angle, according to this interpretation, was either personal delusion or later invention. The truth likely falls between these poles. Sarah lived in an era obsessed with spiritualism. The Fox sisters had launched the spiritualist movement in 1848. By the 1880s, seances were common entertainment among the wealthy. Contact with the dead seemed plausible to millions of Americans, including educated ones. Sarah may well have consulted mediums. She may well have believed the Winchester fortune carried moral debt. And she may have found in construction something therapeutic, regardless of supernatural justification. Being weak in a world built by men who profited from killing teaches you things. It teaches you that wealth alone does not grant innocence, that comfort purchased with blood money feels different from comfort earned otherwise, that living as a woman with the power of capital but not the power of patriarchy creates a strange in-between space. Sarah never ran the Winchester Company. She owned half of it but had no voice in its management. Male executives made production decisions. She simply received dividends, $1,000 per day, every day, from rifles she did not manufacture, but whose profits she could not refuse without impoverishing herself. Perhaps the house was apology. Perhaps it was distraction. Perhaps it was penance, employment, madness, or simply something to do with days that stretched endlessly after loss. Perhaps all of these at once. The house would speak for her in ways she refused to speak for herself. Sarah gave almost no interviews. She avoided photographers. She built walls around the property and hired guards to ensure privacy. The world could speculate. Sarah would build. In 1884, Sarah purchased the 8-room farmhouse from Dr. Robert Caldwell for approximately $12,000. The property included 162 acres of orchards and farmland. The house sat on relatively flat land in the Santa Clara Valley, surrounded by apricot and prune orchards. San Jose was growing, but remained far smaller than San Francisco, 40 miles north. The location offered Sarah privacy, pleasant climate, and distance from Connecticut's social expectations. She hired local contractors and carpenters. No single architect oversaw the project. No comprehensive plan existed. Sarah would meet with foremen, sketch rough ideas, make decisions daily, and change them just as quickly. This pattern would continue for nearly 4 decades. Rooms were framed and built, then demolished days later, because Sarah changed her mind. Staircases were constructed, found unsatisfactory, torn out, and rebuilt. Wings were added, modified, expanded, sealed off. The house grew through accumulation and revision, not through master planning. Construction began modestly. The existing structure was enlarged, rooms added, modern amenities installed. Sarah had money to spend and spent it on quality. Imported hardwoods, mahogany, rosewood, teak. Tiffany art glass windows, custom designed with intricate patterns. Gold and silver chandeliers. Parquet floors laid in complex geometric patterns. She did not build cheaply. Every material reflected wealth and taste. Early photographs show a large Victorian mansion, impressive but not bizarre. The strangeness accumulated gradually. As Sarah added rooms, she began experimenting with layout, doors placed at odd heights, staircases that climbed 9 steps, reached a landing, then descended 7 steps, going nowhere. Windows set into floors, cabinets that opened onto walls. Some attribute this to confusion tactics for spirits. Others point to Sarah's petite height, just over 4 feet tall, and suggest she designed spaces comfortable for herself. Still others note the influence of earthquakes. California's seismic activity may have prompted structural redundancies and strange angles that actually improved stability. The construction crew worked in shifts, 24 hours a day. Hammering never stopped. Neighbors complained about the noise. Sarah paid them off or ignored them. The sound of construction became the house's heartbeat, day and night, year after year, decade after decade. Lumber arrived by the wagon load. Craftsmen came and went, though a core group remained employed for years. Sarah paid well, better than most employers. Carpenters earned $3 per day when the average wage hovered around $1.50. She demanded quality work and compensated accordingly. By 1890, the house had grown significantly. Multiple stories, dozens of rooms, a water tower for indoor plumbing, gas lighting being converted to electricity. Sarah lived in a small section of the house while construction continued around her. She moved from room to room as new spaces became habitable and old ones were demolished or sealed off. The house was never static, never complete. It existed in perpetual becoming. Scale became part of the strangeness. Most wealthy estates, even enormous ones, followed architectural logic. They expanded symmetrically. Wings balanced. Styles remained consistent. Sarah's house did none of this. Victorian ornamentation mixed with Gothic details. Queen Anne turrets sprouted next to Moorish elements. The structure lacked stylistic unity because it lacked unified vision. Each section reflected Sarah's mood, interests, or reading at the time of construction. She studied architecture voraciously, ordering books from around the world. She incorporated ideas from dozens of traditions without concern for coherence. Visitors who arrived during construction years left confused accounts. A house that seemed to shift every time they visited. Rooms that disappeared. Hallways that led different directions. The place resisted mapping. Sarah refused most visitors anyway. The property was private, not a showpiece. She did not host grand parties or seek to impress San Jose society. The house was not built for others. It was built for her, or for something she needed to do, or to appease something she needed to appease. The distinction hardly mattered. The hammering continued. Construction required infrastructure. The house sat miles from San Jose's downtown, connected by dirt roads that became mud in winter. Lumber, glass, hardware, furnishings, everything had to be transported to the site. Sarah established accounts with suppliers in San Francisco and San Jose. Rail cars brought materials from the East Coast. Shipments arrived weekly. By the 1890s, the house had become one of the largest employers in the area, with construction crews ranging from 12 to 22 workers, depending on the phase of building. The workforce was overwhelmingly male, mostly white, and predominantly skilled tradesmen: carpenters, plasterers, glaziers, masons, electricians, plumbers. Sarah hired the best available and paid them well enough to ensure loyalty and silence. The household staff was separate from the construction crews. By 1900, the house employed roughly 15 to 22 domestic workers: housekeepers, cooks, gardeners, stable hands, a personal secretary. Most lived on the property in servants' quarters. The house had grown large enough to require a small village to maintain it. The construction foreman during the peak years was a man named John Hanson. He supervised the crews, interpreted Sarah's often cryptic instructions, and ensured work continued around the clock. Hanson was reportedly one of the few people Sarah met with regularly. She would sketch ideas on scraps of paper or explain what she wanted verbally, sometimes in the middle of the night. Hanson would translate her vision into actual construction. When Sarah changed her mind, which happened constantly, Hanson tore down and rebuilt without complaint. The pay was too good to argue. Materials came from everywhere: hardwoods from South America, Europe, Asia, marble from quarries in Vermont and Italy, art glass from Tiffany Studios in New York, hardware cast in Connecticut. The house became a catalog of global craftsmanship, assembled in California by local workers. Some rooms featured exotic woods most carpenters never saw in their careers. Others had floors inlaid with mother-of-pearl or rare Australian wood. Sarah had resources and used them without restraint. Technology mattered to her. The house included some of the earliest electric lighting in California, installed in the 1890s when electricity remained uncommon in homes. Sarah had gas lighting converted to electric, though she kept gas jets as backup. The house had indoor plumbing with hot and cold running water, rare in that era. Steam heating systems, multiple kitchens, each with modern appliances, 3 working elevators, including one of the first residential elevators in California, a telephone system connecting different parts of the house, installed before telephones became common. Sarah embraced modern conveniences even as she built a structure that defied modern architectural logic. The grounds required equal attention. Sarah had the orchards maintained, though she gradually replaced productive fruit trees with ornamental plantings. Elaborate gardens spread across the property, rose gardens, hedge mazes, exotic plants imported from around the world. Greenhouses provided year-round cultivation. Gardeners worked full-time to maintain the landscaping. The estate was meant to be self-sufficient in some ways, producing some of its own food while also serving as Sarah's private sanctuary. Accounts from workers who spent years on the property suggest complicated feelings. On one hand, Sarah paid better than most employers and provided steady work during an era of economic volatility. On the other hand, the work was strange. Tearing down last week's construction to rebuild according to new plans felt wasteful to men who prided themselves on permanent craftsmanship. Some workers left frustrated by the seemingly pointless revisions. Others stayed for decades, drawn by wages and perhaps by curiosity about where the project would lead. The hammering continued, the house grew, and Sarah, always private, remained an enigma even to the people who built her vision.
By 1900, the Winchester House had become San Jose's most visible oddity. Local newspapers ran occasional stories, usually mocking. The Mystery House label emerged during Sarah's lifetime, though she never used it herself. To her, it was simply home. To everyone else, it was an architectural riddle they couldn't solve. The structure rose 7 stories at its peak, the tallest residential building in the region. Towers and turrets broke the skyline. The property covered acres, though the exact footprint kept changing. Room counts were impossible to verify because Sarah sealed off sections, demolished wings, and rebuilt constantly. Contractors who worked different years gave contradictory descriptions. The house existed in flux. Sarah lived reclusively, but not invisibly. She traveled occasionally, usually to Europe to purchase furnishings and art. She maintained connections with New Haven through correspondence, but never returned. She attended seances, according to some accounts, though these likely occurred privately in her home rather than publicly. She read extensively and ordered books by the crate. She played piano, often late at night when construction paused. Neighbors miles away claimed they could hear hammering at all hours and occasionally piano music drifting through the night. The house home ran on strict schedules despite its mistress's eccentricities. Meals were served at precise times. Staff maintained cleanliness in habitable rooms while construction chaos reigned elsewhere. Sarah demanded order in daily operations even as she encouraged architectural disorder. The contradiction defined the place. Beauty and strangeness coexisted. Functionality and absurdity shared the same walls. San Jose society found Sarah both fascinating and frustrating. She was one of the wealthiest residents but refused to participate in social life. No invitations to her home, no attendance at others' events. Occasional sightings in town, usually shopping or meeting with contractors, but no sustained engagement. She donated to charities quietly, often anonymously. The local hospital received substantial funds. Churches benefited from her generosity, but Sarah herself remained withdrawn.
The house became San Jose's most reliable topic of gossip. Why would anyone build like this? Was she truly mad, or was there method beneath the strangeness? Local speculation ran wild. Some claimed Sarah conducted occult rituals. Others insisted she was a saint doing penance. A few suggested she was simply eccentric but harmless. The truth, that Sarah was a grieving, wealthy widow processing trauma through architecture, was too mundane for a culture that preferred Gothic explanations. Then April 18, 1906 arrived. At 5:12 a.m., the San Francisco earthquake struck. The quake registered approximately 7.9 magnitude, one of the most powerful in California history. The shaking lasted less than a minute, but devastated the region. San Francisco burned for 3 days. Across the Bay Area, buildings collapsed, roads cracked, and infrastructure failed. In San Jose, 40 miles from the epicenter, the shaking was severe. Brick buildings crumbled, chimneys fell, and at the Winchester House, the tallest structure for miles, the 7th floor collapsed. Sarah was sleeping in a bedroom on an upper floor when the quake hit. Walls buckled. The entire top section of the house pancaked downward. Sarah was trapped briefly, but escaped with minor injuries. Servants and workers pulled her from the rubble. Remarkably, no one died.
Given that roughly 20 people lived on the property and construction crews were preparing for the day's work, the survival rate was extraordinary. The damage was extensive. The 7-story central tower was destroyed, reduced to 3 stories. Chimneys collapsed throughout the house. Windows shattered. Ornate plasterwork cracked and fell. Some wings shifted on their foundations. But the house did not fall entirely. The chaotic, redundant, seemingly irrational construction, all those odd angles and unexpected supports, may have actually saved it. Engineers who studied the structure later noted that traditional Victorian architecture would likely have collapsed completely. Sarah's strange methods created structural flexibility that absorbed seismic stress. Sarah interpreted the earthquake as confirmation. Whether she believed spirits caused it or simply saw it as a reminder of mortality, she responded by sealing off the damaged upper floors permanently. The house would never again rise higher than 4 stories in most sections. She also sealed the main entrance at the front of the house, deciding it was unlucky. From 1906 forward, everyone entered through side or rear doors. The grand front entrance, with its elaborate porch and Tiffany windows, was boarded up and never used again. Construction resumed within days. Sarah hired workers to clear rubble and begin repairs. But instead of rebuilding to the original design, she started building in new directions. More wings, more rooms, more experiments with layout and structure. If anything, the earthquake accelerated her obsession. The hammering grew louder, the house spread wider, and the question that haunted her from the beginning remained unanswered. Could any amount of building ever be enough? A day at the Winchester house began long before Sarah woke. 4 in the morning, sometimes earlier. Kitchen staff lit the coal ranges, large cast-iron stoves that required constant feeding. Scullery maids hauled water even though the house had modern plumbing. Kitchens still depended on backup systems and manual labor. Housemaids moved through reception rooms, cleaning grates, laying fresh fires in dozens of fireplaces, dusting furniture that had been dusted yesterday and would be dusted again tomorrow. The house had to be fully awake and functioning before Sarah opened her eyes. The scale of domestic labor was enormous. By 1900, the house employed between 15 and 22 permanent household staff, separate from construction crews. The hierarchy below stairs was strict. At the top, a head housekeeper. At various times, this was a woman named Mrs. Henrietta Sivers, who managed the domestic staff and reported directly to Sarah. The butler, when Sarah employed one, handled male staff and formal service. Just beneath them came personal servants, Sarah's maid, who dressed her and managed her private chambers, the cook who planned menus and supervised kitchen work. Below that layer came housemaids, parlor maids, and laundry workers. Lower still, kitchen helpers and scullery maids, often young women in their teens doing the filthiest work for the smallest pay. At the very bottom, stable hands and groundskeepers who maintained horses, carriages, and later automobiles, along with the extensive gardens. Everyone knew their place. Crossing a boundary meant consequences, demotion, wage reduction, or dismissal. Step past the showpiece rooms and another world appears. Behind the beauty lies infrastructure. The basement contains massive boiler systems, coal furnaces that heated water for radiators throughout the house. Separate from the main basement, service corridors weave through the building like a second circulatory system. Narrow, unadorned staircases connect floors without passing through public spaces. Long hallways painted institutional green and lit by bare bulbs allow staff to move unseen. The architecture enforced invisibility. Sarah and her guests never had to encounter the people who made comfort possible. The servants' quarters occupied the least desirable spaces, rooms without views, smaller dimensions, simpler furnishings. While Sarah slept in elaborately decorated bedrooms with custom woodwork and Tiffany windows, her staff slept in plain rooms with basic furniture. While guests dined on imported china in the formal dining room, staff ate in a separate servants' dining hall at wooden tables. The distance between those who serve and those who are served was built into the walls. The bell system controlled movement. Every major room upstairs had a pull cord. When someone tugged it, a corresponding bell rang downstairs in the servants' corridor.
panel displayed which room was calling. Experienced staff could identify the bell by sound even without checking the panel. When a bell rang, someone moved immediately. Sarah was known to be demanding about response time. The family and their guests did not wait. Wages varied by position and reflected the era's standards. A head housekeeper at the Winchester House earned roughly $40 to $50 per month in the 1900s, about $1,400 to $1,800 per year. Housemaids earned $20 to $30 per month. Scullery maids earned $12 to $18 per month. The cook drew closer to $50. Gardeners and stable hands earned similar amounts. By contemporary standards, these were competitive wages, better than many wealthy households offered. But context changes everything.
Sarah's daily income from Winchester rifle dividends was approximately $1,000, over $30,000 in modern currency. Her annual income from investments alone was roughly $365,000 in 1900s dollars, over $10 million today. The entire annual wage bill for the household came to perhaps $10,000 to $15,000 per year. In other words, Sarah spent 2 to 3 weeks of income on the people who ran her entire estate. She routinely spent more on a single piece of furniture than she paid her head housekeeper for a year of work. The hours were long. Housemaids worked from 4 or 5 in the morning until evening, with breaks for meals. During large projects or when Sarah entertained guests, rare but not unheard of, shifts extended to 12 or 14 hours. The work was physically demanding, hauling coal, carrying water, scrubbing floors, washing windows. The house had 10,000 windows by some estimates. Cleaning them was an ongoing task that never ended. Fires had to be laid in 47 fireplaces. Floors had to be mopped, rugs beaten, silver polished, brass shined. The risks were real: burns from stoves and hot water, cuts from broken glass, construction debris was constant, falls on staircases, some of which Sarah designed with odd dimensions that made them dangerous, exhaustion from long hours, and always the risk of dismissal. Servants had no job security. A mistake, a complaint, a personality conflict could mean immediate termination. Losing a position at the Winchester House meant losing income, housing, meals, and the reference needed to find the next job. The power imbalance was absolute. What the servants actually thought of Sarah is only partly visible. Few left written accounts. Henrietta Sivers, the head housekeeper, stayed for decades, suggesting she found the conditions acceptable or better than alternatives. Some staff members worked at the house for 10 or 20 years. Longevity implies tolerable treatment. Sarah was not known as a cruel mistress. By most accounts, she was polite, paid on time, and did not engage in the casual cruelty common among Gilded Age employers. Yet, kindness from a position of total control is still a form of control. Sarah had the power to hire, fire, set wages, dictate hours, and shape lives. Her staff had the power to quit and find other work, but in an economy with limited options for working-class women, especially immigrant women who filled many domestic positions, quitting was not simple. The relationship was fundamentally transactional: labor for wages, invisibility for employment, silence for security. A gentle mistress is still a mistress. Sarah treated her staff better than many of her peers. She paid competitively. She provided steady work during an era of economic instability. But the underlying structure remained. Her comfort depended on their labor, her privacy on their invisibility, her architectural obsession on their daily toil. They hauled coal to warm her rooms. They cleaned windows she broke during revisions. They cooked meals, washed dishes, tended gardens, and vanished into service corridors before she could see them. The house was magnificent. The house was also a machine that ate labor and transformed it into one woman's perpetual architectural experiment. Both things were true. The beauty was real. The cost was real. And most of the people who made that beauty possible remain nameless in the historical record, reduced to job titles and approximate wage figures, their individual lives and thoughts largely lost to time. While construction consumed the property's exterior attention, daily life inside required careful choreography. Sarah maintained a routine despite the house's chaos. She woke late, usually mid-morning. Breakfast was served in whichever dining room she currently preferred. The house had several, and she rotated between them. After eating, she spent hours playing piano or reading.
She corresponded with business managers about Winchester Company dividends and property investments. She met with the foreman to discuss the day's construction plans, often sketching rough ideas that would be refined into actual building instructions. Afternoons might include gardening, walking the grounds, or simply sitting in one of the many conservatories. Sarah loved plants and maintained extensive greenhouses. Orchids, rare ferns, exotic flowers shipped from around the world. The gardens required multiple full-time gardeners to maintain. Sarah involved herself directly, often overseeing plantings and arrangements. In this realm, she exercised the same control she applied to construction. Constant revision, experimentation, and refusal to settle on a final design. Evenings brought dinner, usually eaten alone in a small private dining room. Sarah rarely entertained. On the few occasions guests visited, usually family members from the East Coast or occasional business associates, formal dining rooms were opened and staff prepared elaborate meals. But these events were exceptional. Most nights, Sarah dined alone, served by staff who appeared and vanished efficiently. After dinner, she often returned to the piano. Neighbors reported hearing music late into the night, classical pieces played with considerable skill. Sarah had been trained in music during her youth and maintained her abilities. The piano provided solace that perhaps construction could not. Where building was external transformation, music was internal expression. Both were ways of filling silence. The house's technology required constant maintenance. The electrical system was complex and frequently needed repairs. The heating system consumed tons of coal monthly. The plumbing, advanced for its time, still required oversight. The elevators needed regular servicing. Sarah paid for all of this without hesitation. Money was never the constraint. The Winchester dividends continued flowing regardless of how she spent them. She could not exhaust her fortune no matter how much she built. San Jose itself was growing. The city's population expanded from roughly 12,000 in 1880 to over 28,000 by 1910. New neighborhoods spread across the valley. The Winchester House, once relatively isolated, found itself increasingly surrounded by development. Sarah purchased adjacent properties when possible to maintain buffer zones. She built fences, planted hedges, hired guards to ensure privacy. The world was encroaching, but she could still buy distance. The construction crews worked in shifts: day shift, night shift, continuous hammering. The sound became part of the property's identity. You could hear the Winchester House before you saw it. The rhythm of hammers and saws, the calls of workers, the crack of lumber being split, the screech of nails being pulled from boards slated for demolition. It was not peaceful. It was not quiet. It was relentlessly active, a house that refused to rest. The workflow was strange by normal construction standards. Most projects follow linear progression: foundation, framing, roofing, interior work, finishing. Sarah's house followed no such logic. Rooms would be built, finished, furnished, then torn apart weeks later because she changed her mind. Wings were added without clear purpose, staircases built to nowhere, doors opening onto walls. Some attribute this to spiritual guidance, building to confuse ghosts. Others see it as architectural experimentation unconstrained by practical concerns. Still others suggest Sarah simply enjoyed the process of building more than the result of building. Whatever the motivation, the effect was clear. The house was alive in a way finished buildings are not. It grew, shrank, mutated, adapted. Rooms appeared and disappeared. Hallways led to different destinations depending on when you walked them. The structure defied mapping because it existed in constant revision. Workers learned to expect changes. Plans drawn one day were obsolete the next. Sarah's vision shifted like weather. Yet beneath the chaos, patterns emerged. Sarah favored certain motifs. The number 13 appeared repeatedly: 13 bathrooms, 13 windows in some rooms, staircases with 13 steps. Spiderweb designs recurred in windows and light fixtures. Sarah apparently loved spiders and considered them good luck. Daisy patterns, Sarah's favorite flower, appeared throughout decorative elements. These repeating symbols suggested method within madness, personal meaning embedded in seemingly random design. The question remained: what was she building toward? A home, clearly, but homes have endpoints. You finish construction, move in, live. Sarah never finished, never considered the house complete. The hammering was not means to an end, but end in itself. Building was the point, the process, not the product. As long as construction continued, something was happening. Movement replaced stasis. Action replaced grief. Noise drowned out the silence where memories lived. The house demanded constant attention. The house was magnificent. The house was also a mechanism for filling time that otherwise stretched empty. Both things were true. And time moved forward, measured not in years but rooms added, staircases built, windows installed. The count kept rising, the house kept growing, and Sarah, at the center of the labyrinth, kept building.
Sarah rarely received visitors, but when she did, the encounters revealed glimpses of her personality that gossip could not capture. Her niece, Marion Marriott, visited several times over the years. Marion's accounts, given in later interviews, describe Sarah as intelligent, articulate, and deeply private, but not antisocial. She enjoyed conversation when she chose to engage. She simply chose rarely. Other visitors included business associates managing her investments and Winchester Company representatives. Sarah maintained involvement in company affairs from a distance, reviewing financial reports and approving major decisions despite having no operational role. The company thrived without her direct management. Production increased through the 1890s and 1900s. Winchester rifles armed American forces in the Spanish-American War. The brand expanded internationally. Every year, dividends grew. Every year, Sarah's fortune compounded. Some accounts mention seances conducted at the house. Sarah allegedly held private spiritualist sessions, consulting with mediums who channeled messages from her dead husband and daughter. These seances supposedly guided construction decisions, spirits demanding certain rooms or warning against specific designs. The evidence for regular seances is thin. One medium, a woman who claimed to have visited the house in the 19-teens, later described elaborate rituals in a room Sarah designated for spirit communication. But the medium's account came decades after Sarah's death and cannot be verified. What is documented, Sarah belonged to the spiritualist movement culturally, if not formally. She attended lectures on theosophy, a spiritual philosophy popular among educated Americans in that era. She owned books on mysticism, reincarnation, and supernatural phenomena. Whether she literally believed spirits guided her building or simply found comfort in spiritual frameworks for processing grief, the distinction mattered less than the result. The house continued growing, and Sarah continued commissioning construction that served no practical purpose. The house gained national attention gradually. Journalists who managed to glimpse the property wrote sensational accounts. Mystery House, Spirit House, House that never stops building. The labels varied, but the fascination remained constant. Sarah never granted interviews. She threatened legal action against newspapers that trespassed. But publicity was inevitable. The house was simply too strange to ignore. By 1910, the structure contained somewhere between 120 and 160 rooms, depending on what counted as a room. 6 kitchens, all functional. 13 bathrooms equipped with modern fixtures. 47 fireplaces, most ornate and custom designed. 2 basements, 4 floors in some sections, 3 in others. The exact dimensions remained elusive because Sarah sealed off completed wings, preventing comprehensive surveys. What tourists eventually came to see was a fraction of what existed. The grounds had transformed from productive orchards into ornamental gardens. Sarah employed 5 full-time gardeners, maintaining acres of plantings. A conservatory housed tropical plants, hedge mazes, rose gardens, fruit trees kept for beauty rather than harvest. The property was a self-contained paradise, walled off from the world, perpetually under construction, perpetually incomplete. The peak of construction came in the 1910s. The house was at its largest, employment was at its highest. Sarah was in her 70s, but still actively directing building. The foreman, John Hanson, had been with her for decades by then and understood her vision as well as anyone could. The system functioned efficiently despite its apparent madness. Workers knew their roles, Staff maintained the household. Sarah managed her wealth and funded the endless project. The arithmetic worked. The machine ran smoothly. The house kept growing. But beneath the success, pressure was building. Not financial. Sarah's fortune remained vast. Not structural. The house, despite its oddities, was stable after earthquake repairs. The pressure was temporal. Sarah was aging. She had no heirs, no children to inherit the property, no clear plan for what would happen after her death. The house was her life's work, but what meaning would it have when she was gone? The question hovered unanswered. The hammering continued, and time, patient and relentless, moved forward toward an endpoint Sarah refused to acknowledge.
The Winchester Mystery House represented something unique in Gilded Age America, a fortune spent on creation that generated nothing. Most wealthy estates served purposes. They housed dynasties. They signaled social position. They operated as agricultural businesses or rental properties. They were investments that appreciated or income-generating assets. The Winchester House was none of these. It produced nothing, earned nothing, housed only Sarah and her staff, and would appreciate only as curiosity, not as functional property. This made Sarah unusual among America's wealthy elite. The Vanderbilts built Biltmore as a statement of arrival into American aristocracy. The Hearsts constructed San Simeon as a power center and entertainment venue. The Rockefellers and Carnegies built to demonstrate taste and philanthropy. Their estates had audiences. Their architecture communicated messages to society. Sarah's house communicated nothing because Sarah wanted it to communicate nothing. It was private expression, not public performance. Yet the house still functioned as statement, intentionally or not. It was evidence of what Gilded Age wealth could do when unconstrained by social expectations, practical needs, or rational planning. It was proof that enough money could sustain permanent construction, perpetual revision, architectural experimentation on a scale that served no purpose beyond itself. The house was its own justification. It existed because Sarah wanted it to exist and had resources to make it real. The contrast between Sarah's reclusiveness and her family's public prominence was stark. The Winchester name was synonymous with American expansion, frontier mythology, and industrial success. Winchester rifles appeared in paintings, advertisements, dime novels. The gun that won the West was marketing slogan and cultural truth. Buffalo Bill's Wild West show featured Winchester rifles. The brand was woven into American identity. And here was the family's wealthiest member, hiding in California, building a labyrinth no one could explain. San Jose society found Sarah both fascinating and frustrating. They wanted her at social events, wanted access to her wealth and her story. She refused both. She donated generously but anonymously. She attended no clubs, no galas, no church socials. The only institution she supported publicly was local charities, particularly those serving children and the poor. Whether this was guilt-driven philanthropy or genuine compassion is unrecorded. Possibly both. The house also represented California's newness and possibility. In the East, Gilded Age mansions followed European models, French chateaux, English manor houses, Italian palazzos. They claimed historical legitimacy through architectural quotation. Sarah's house rejected that approach. It mixed styles promiscuously: Queen Anne, Gothic, Moorish, Victorian, elements that had no business coexisting, but did anyway. It was American in its lack of historical constraint, its willingness to experiment, its indifference to tradition. It was Western in its sprawl, its land use, its assumption that space was abundant and rules were flexible. By 1915, the house had settled into its final phase. Construction continued, but at a slower pace. Sarah was in her mid-70s, and her health was declining. The building was as large as it would get, roughly 160 rooms spread across 4 acres of floor space. The workforce remained steady, but no longer expanded. The house had reached equilibrium, large enough to require constant maintenance, active enough to employ dozens, strange enough to fuel endless local speculation. Then World War I arrived. The war affected Sarah indirectly, but significantly. The Winchester Company ramped up production, selling rifles to Allied forces. Profits soared. Sarah's dividends increased. The fortune that had enabled her building project was once again growing through wartime demand. More deaths meant more money, meant more construction. The cycle that began with Civil War profits and continued through Western expansion now repeated with European slaughter. Winchester rifles killed on industrial scale across French trenches and Belgian fields. And in California, dividends arrived on schedule, and the hammering continued. Sarah did not comment publicly on the war. Whether she connected Winchester profits to European casualties, whether she wrestled with the same guilt that may have driven her building, the historical record does not say. She was in her 70s, increasingly frail, focused on her immediate world of gardens and construction. The war was distant, abstract, someone else's problem. Yet it funded her obsession just as previous violence had funded everything else. The blood money kept flowing, the house kept growing, and the question remained suspended. Could any amount of building ever balance the books? By 1919, Sarah was 80 years old. Construction had continued for 35 years without pause. The house was enormous, eccentric, and entirely hers. She had spent an estimated $5.5 million on the project, over $100 million in modern currency. The daily hammering that had defined the property for decades finally began to slow. Not by Sarah's choice, by necessity. Her health was failing. Sarah suffered from arthritis, making movement difficult. She used one of the house's elevators frequently, unable to manage stairs. Her vision was declining, her energy diminished. She still gave construction orders, but less frequently. The crews reduced to skeleton shifts, focusing on maintenance rather than new building. For the first time in decades, the Winchester house was not actively growing. It was simply existing. The property had become legendary in California. Newspapers ran occasional features, usually speculating about Sarah's motivations. The Mystery House label was firmly established. Tour companies in San Jose offered distant views of the property as part of city tours, though no one could enter. Sarah's reclusiveness only increased fascination. What was inside? Why build like this? Was she mad, or was there method? Sarah's staff remained loyal. Many had worked for her for decades. They knew her routines, understood her eccentricities, and maintained the household despite its strangeness. The head housekeeper, Henrietta Sivers, managed daily operations. The foreman, John Hanson, oversaw what little construction continued. The gardeners maintained the grounds. The machine kept running, but the original animating force was weakening. In 1920, Sarah drafted a will. She left the property to her niece, Marion Marriott, along with a modest cash inheritance. The bulk of her fortune, still substantial despite decades of construction spending, went to various charities. The Winchester Company shares were to be sold, proceeds distributed. Sarah made no provisions for the house's future use. She did not designate it as a museum or historical site. She simply passed it to Marion, who would have to decide what to do with an enormous, bizarre, unmarketable mansion. The hammering stopped entirely in September 1922. Sarah's health had deteriorated to the point that construction was impossible. She was bedridden, attended by nurses and staff. The house fell silent for the first time in 38 years. Neighbors noticed. The absence of sound was eerie after decades of constant noise. The house waited. Sarah declined. On September 5, 1922, Sarah Winchester died in her sleep. She was 83 years old. She had lived in the house for 38 years, building continuously until her body could no longer sustain the effort. The construction that had defined her life ended with her death. The house was finally finished, not by design, but by mortality. The hammering would never resume. The structure would never grow again. What Sarah built would have to stand as it was, incomplete, inexplicable, and entirely hers. Her death made national news. Obituaries focused on the mystery. Why had she built? What drove the obsession? Journalists speculated about ghosts, guilt, madness, grief. Few noted the simpler truth. Sarah Winchester had inherited a fortune built on weapons that killed hundreds of thousands, and she spent her life transforming that money into something that killed no one. She built instead of destroyed.
She created work instead of hoarding wealth. She gave local workers steady employment for decades. Her methods were strange, her vision inexplicable, but her actions were arguably more ethical than most Gilded Age heirs who spent fortunes on yachts, jewels, and European vacations. Marion Marriott inherited the property and immediately faced impossible decisions. The house was enormous, expensive to maintain, and had no practical use. It could not be sold. Who would buy it? It could not be lived in comfortably. Too large, too strange. It could barely be understood. No comprehensive floor plans existed. Marion walked through it and realized Sarah had created something that only made sense to Sarah. The rest of the world would have to decode it or simply marvel at its strangeness. Within months, Marion began the process of turning the house into a tourist attraction. If it could not function as a home, perhaps it could function as spectacle. In February 1923, less than 6 months after Sarah's death, the Winchester Mystery House opened to public tours. Visitors paid 50 cents to see the architectural oddities, staircases to nowhere, doors opening onto walls, the sealed front entrance, the room where seances allegedly occurred. The narrative that tours emphasized was supernatural, the haunted widow building to appease spirits. It was simpler than the truth and sold better. The transformation from private obsession to public curiosity was complete. What Sarah built for herself became entertainment for others. The house that was meant to confuse spirits now confused tourists. The architecture that served Sarah's psychological needs became a business venture that would sustain the property through the Depression, World War II, and into the present century. The hammering had stopped, but the house endured, and the questions Sarah never answered remained unanswered, hanging in the air like dust motes in abandoned rooms.
Marion Marriott faced arithmetic that was brutally clear. The house cost thousands of dollars per month to maintain: taxes, utilities, staff wages, repairs. It generated zero income in its current state. Sarah's estate included substantial assets, but not infinite ones. Without intervention, the property would consume its inheritance within years, then be seized for unpaid taxes and auctioned for whatever a buyer would pay, likely demolition value. Marion consulted with lawyers and business advisors. The consensus was unanimous. The house could not function as private residence. It was too large, too strange, too expensive. Selling it was nearly impossible. The real estate market in 1920s San Jose offered no buyers for a 16-room architectural experiment. The structure's only value was as a curiosity. If people were fascinated by its strangeness, perhaps they would pay to see it. In early 1923, Marion hired John Hanson, Sarah's longtime foreman, to help map the property. Hanson knew the house better than anyone except Sarah herself. He had built most of it under her direction. He spent months walking the rooms, counting doors and windows, documenting staircases and passages. His survey was the first comprehensive inventory since construction began. What he found confirmed what everyone suspected: the house defied logic. Rooms built and sealed, hallways that looped back on themselves, architectural features that served no function. Hanson compiled what would become the foundation of tourist narratives, the catalog of oddities that made the house marketable. Marion decided to open the property to tours. She hired a tour manager, developed a route through the most interesting rooms, and began advertising. The promotional materials highlighted Sarah's alleged seances, her fear of spirits, the construction meant to confuse ghosts. Whether Marion believed these stories or simply recognized their commercial value is unclear. What mattered was that tourists believed them, or at least found them entertaining enough to pay admission. The Winchester Mystery House opened to the public in February 1923. Initial ticket price was 50 cents, roughly $8 in modern currency. The tours lasted about an hour, covering perhaps 20 to 30 rooms out of the house's 160. Tour guides led groups through carefully selected spaces: the grand ballroom with its expensive but bizarre features, the seance room where Sarah allegedly communicated with spirits, staircases that climbed to ceilings, the door that opened to an 8-foot drop, windows set into floors. The response exceeded expectations. Thousands of people came in the first year. San Jose residents brought visiting relatives. Tourists driving through California stopped to see the famous Mystery House. Local newspapers covered the opening, and word spread regionally. The house that had been Sarah's private obsession became Northern California's premier architectural curiosity. Marion reinvested profits into property maintenance, ensuring the house remained presentable even as construction ceased forever.
But success created new pressures. The house was designed for Sarah, not for public traffic. Floors wore down under thousands of footsteps. Doors and fixtures required frequent repair. The heating system was inadequate for opening the building to visitors year-round. The plumbing, designed for a household of 20, struggled with public restrooms. Marion spent continuously on upgrades and maintenance. The house demanded resources even in death as it had in life. The Great Depression hit in 1929, devastating California's economy. Tourism declined sharply. Families could not afford 50 cents for curiosity when they struggled to buy food. Admission prices dropped to 25 cents. Tour frequency reduced. Staff was cut. Yet the house survived. It was one of the few Depression-era tourist attractions that remained open, sustained by people's need for escape and strangeness. Even in hard times, enough visitors came to cover basic costs. During the 1930s, the house's narrative solidified. Tour guides elaborated the ghost story, adding details that may or may not have been accurate. They claimed Sarah never slept in the same room twice for fear spirits would find her. They said she wore a veil constantly to hide from ghosts. They described midnight seances where Sarah received architectural instructions from the dead. Some of these claims had basis in fact. Many were embellishments designed to enhance the tour experience. The line between history and hokum blurred, and the house became as much performance as preservation. Marion managed the property until 1938, when she sold it to a group of investors who continued operating it as a tourist attraction. The sale price was approximately $135,000, a fraction of what Sarah spent building it, but more than Marion could have gotten otherwise. The new owners maintained the tour operation, expanded marketing, and gradually increased ticket prices as the economy recovered. The house had found its post-Sarah purpose, spectacle that generated just enough income to sustain itself. During World War II, new challenges and opportunities. Tourism declined again as gasoline rationing limited recreational travel. But the war also brought increased awareness of Winchester rifles as American forces carried them in combat. The company's continued prominence kept public interest in the Winchester name alive, which indirectly benefited the Mystery House. After the war, tourism boomed. Americans took road trips across California, and the Winchester Mystery House became standard stop. The odd structure built by the rifle fortune heiress fascinated a generation that had just fought with Winchester-made weapons. By 1950, the house was firmly established as California landmark. It had survived Sarah's death, the Depression, World War II, and multiple changes in ownership. What had been architectural obsession was now historical artifact. The rooms that once confused spirits now confused tourists, which was close enough to Sarah's original intent to feel appropriate. The house endured. Whether Sarah would have approved of its transformation into a commercial venture is unknowable, but the alternative, demolition, abandonment, tax seizure, would certainly have been worse. The house stood. That much had been accomplished, and that, perhaps, was what mattered most.
The house in its current form represents carefully curated strangeness. Of the estimated 160 rooms Sarah built, tourists see perhaps 30 to 40 on standard tours. The rest remain closed, some sealed since Sarah's time, others simply omitted from public routes for safety or practical reasons. What visitors experience is the highlight reel, the oddities that best illustrate the house's reputation. Staircases to nowhere, doors opening onto walls, the window built into the floor, the seance room with its midnight blue walls and single entrance. The grand ballroom showcases Sarah's wealth and taste. Parquet floors in rare woods, some of which cost $1,000 per square foot in 1890s currency. Hand-carved wood panels, a pipe organ that was never played. Sarah ordered it installed but died before it was completed. Tiffany art glass windows that cost thousands each. The room is beautiful and bizarre simultaneously, a showcase of craftsmanship in a house that defies architectural logic. The daisy bedroom contains elaborate inlaid wood floors featuring daisy patterns, Sarah's favorite flower. The workmanship required thousands of hours. Individual pieces of wood, maple, rosewood, mahogany, teak, were cut into tiny shapes and assembled into complex geometric and floral patterns. The cost per square foot exceeded what most Americans earned in a year. Sarah's bedroom for a season, then abandoned when she moved to another part of the house during construction. The South Conservatory represents Sarah's love of plants and natural light. Massive windows, some imported from Europe. Ornamental ironwork. Space designed for tropical plants that could not survive California's dry summers outdoors. Sarah spent hours here, tending orchids and exotic ferns. The room demonstrates that beauty mattered to her, that aesthetic pleasure was part of the building process, not just obsessive construction. The séance room draws the most tourist attention. Midnight blue walls, one entrance, one exit. A cabinet with 13 coat hooks, the number Sarah allegedly considered lucky. Tour guides claim Sarah held nightly séances here, communicating with spirits who guided construction decisions. Evidence for regular séances is thin, but the room's existence is undeniable. Whether Sarah used it for spiritualism, meditation, or simply privacy, she built it deliberately and returned to it frequently. The tour route carefully avoids mentioning the servants who made the house function. You walk through public rooms, see beauty and oddities, hear about ghosts and grief. You do not see the service corridors, the basement boiler rooms, the servants' quarters. The architecture of invisibility that allowed Sarah to live surrounded by workers she never saw is maintained in the tour experience. Visitors consume spectacle without confronting the labor that created and sustained it. The grounds have been simplified. Most of the gardens Sarah maintained are gone, replaced by parking lots and gift shops. A few hedges and some ornamental plantings remain, but the extensive orchards, conservatories, and hedge mazes have disappeared. The property has been reduced from 162 acres to about 4.5 acres. Surrounding land was sold off decades ago, now occupied by suburban development. The house that once stood isolated among orchards is now surrounded by commercial strips and residential neighborhoods. San Jose grew around it, and the Mystery House became an island of strangeness in ordinary suburbia. The business model evolved over decades. In addition to standard tours, the house now offers premium experiences, nighttime flashlight tours emphasizing ghost stories, behind-the-scenes tours showing areas normally closed, seasonal events playing up the spooky reputation. The Winchester Mystery House has leaned into its haunted reputation, capitalizing on American fascination with the supernatural. Halloween is peak season. Special effects, actors dressed as ghosts, theatrical presentations that have nothing to do with Sarah but generate revenue that maintains the property. Academic interest has grown alongside commercial exploitation. Architectural historians study the house as example of experimental building unconstrained by conventional planning. Psychologists analyze Sarah's motivations, debating whether her behavior reflected grief, obsessive-compulsive disorder, or rational response to trauma. Gender studies scholars examine Sarah as wealthy woman who spent her fortune on her own terms rather than social expectations. The house has become text that different disciplines read different ways, finding evidence for their frameworks in Sarah's architectural choices. Preserving the structure requires constant work and substantial funds. Wood rots, foundations shift, roofs leak. The house contains materials from around the world, some of which are no longer available or legal to import. Repairs must match original craftsmanship while meeting modern building codes. The organization managing the property, currently Winchester Mystery House, LLC, balances preservation, commercial viability, and historical accuracy. Sometimes those priorities conflict. The house is artifact and business simultaneously, which creates tensions Sarah never faced when it was simply home. The earthquake damage from 1906 has been partially restored in some areas, left intact in others. The sealed front entrance stays closed, both for historical authenticity and structural reasons. Some of Sarah's stranger additions have been stabilized but not altered. The staircase to nowhere is now behind plexiglass, preventing tourists from climbing it, but preserving the absurdity. The house is frozen in time, or rather frozen in multiple times. Sarah's construction, Marion's commercialization, decades of subsequent modification. What tourists take away varies. Some leave convinced Sarah was mad, driven to architectural insanity by grief and guilt. Others see her as eccentric but rational, a woman who found purpose in building and had resources to indulge her interests. Still others focus on the craftsmanship, marveling at the quality of woodwork and glass regardless of the floor plan's logic. A few recognize the deeper questions. What does it mean to inherit blood money? How do you process guilt that no amount of construction can resolve? What do you build when the fortune funding your building came from death? The house is a mirror. What people see depends on what they bring to it. If you believe in ghosts, you see haunted mansion. If you believe in psychology, you see grief manifested in architecture. If you believe in Gilded Age excess, you see wasteful spending by the idle rich. If you believe in artistic freedom, you see woman creating on her own terms. All of these interpretations exist simultaneously, layered like the house's many rooms, none entirely wrong, none entirely complete. The Winchester Mystery House stands today as one of California's most visited historic homes, attracting hundreds of thousands of tourists annually. Admission prices have risen from Marion's original 50 cents to approximately $50 or more depending on tour type. The property generates millions in annual revenue, supporting staff, maintenance, and marketing. What Sarah built as private obsession now operates as moderately successful small business. The transformation is complete. The house that was meant to appease spirits now appeases profit margins. The tours have evolved to emphasize spectacle over historical accuracy. Theatrical elements, background music, strategic lighting, tour guides trained in dramatic storytelling create atmosphere that may not reflect Sarah's actual experience, but certainly enhances tourist experience. The house has become performance, with Sarah Winchester cast as protagonist in a Gothic tale that flattens her complexity into digestible narrative. Haunted widow builds maze to confuse ghosts. The story is compelling, marketable, and incomplete. Historians have pushed back against the supernatural narrative in recent years. Academic research suggests Sarah was not as isolated or disturbed as popular culture portrays. She maintained business relationships, corresponded with family, managed her investments competently. The constant construction may have reflected grief and perhaps some spiritual beliefs, but it also reflected wealth, agency, and a woman exercising control over her environment in ways denied to most women of her era. Building was power. Sarah had both wealth and will to build, and she did so on her terms for nearly 4 decades. The labor that made the house possible remains largely invisible in official narratives. Tour guides mention construction workers in passing, but rarely name them or detail their contributions. The servants who maintained the household during Sarah's lifetime are almost entirely absent from the story tourists hear. The architecture of invisibility that Sarah designed, the service corridors, the separate stairs, the below-stairs world, is maintained in how the house's history is told. The focus stays on Sarah, her grief, her wealth, her eccentricity. The people who built and maintained her vision remain anonymous, their labor acknowledged in general terms, but not honored specifically. This reflects broader patterns in how Gilded Age properties are presented. The focus is overwhelmingly on the wealthy owners, their taste, their vision, their stories. The workers fade into background, reduced to labor statistics and wage figures. Yet without them, none of these properties would exist. The Winchester Mystery House required thousands of hours of skilled carpentry, masonry, glazing, plastering. It required daily maintenance by housekeepers, cooks, gardeners, stable hands. Sarah designed it and funded it, but she did not build it or maintain it alone. Her vision depended on others' labor, and those others are largely written out of the story. The question of what Sarah actually believed remains unresolved. Did she genuinely think spirits guided her construction? Was she communicating with the dead or processing grief through ritualized building? Definitive evidence is sparse. What exists suggests Sarah was more rational than legend portrays, but also more complex than simple eccentricity explains. She likely held spiritualist beliefs common to her era, while also being practical businesswoman who managed substantial wealth competently. Both things can be true simultaneously. The Winchester rifle legacy complicates any celebration of the house. Sarah's fortune came from weapons that killed hundreds of thousands. The Winchester repeating rifle was instrumental in the near extinction of buffalo, the displacement and slaughter of indigenous peoples, and countless individual murders across the American West and beyond. Whether Sarah built to atone for this legacy, the architectural effort cannot erase that history. The house stands as both creation and reminder, beauty built on blood, craft funded by carnage. Modern visitors rarely confront this directly. Tour narratives focus on ghosts and oddities, not on the source of Sarah's wealth or the human costs that funded her building. This is understandable from a business perspective. Tourists prefer Gothic romance to moral reckoning, but it perpetuates incomplete storytelling. The Winchester Mystery House is not just strange architecture. It is also artifact of American expansion, industrialization, and violence. The house is document of how wealth accumulated in Gilded Age America and what one heir chose to do with her inheritance. Those choices were strange, but they were also arguably more humane than most wealthy heirs in that era. Sarah created employment for hundreds over nearly 4 decades. She paid competitively, supported local economy, and transformed blood money into wages for workers who needed them. This was not charity. She demanded labor in return, but it was distribution of wealth that benefited more people than if she had simply hoarded her fortune or spent it on conventional luxuries. The house is monument to grief, yes, but also to one woman's decades-long effort to do something with inherited guilt and unwanted fortune. The effort was imperfect, strange, and ultimately futile in resolving the underlying moral problem, but it was an effort. The question of preservation versus interpretation continues to create tension. Should the house be maintained as Sarah left it, or can modern additions and theatrical elements be justified if they generate revenue needed for maintenance? Should tour narratives prioritize historical accuracy or entertaining storytelling that keeps visitors coming? These are not abstract questions. They determine what future generations will know about Sarah Winchester, about Gilded Age wealth, about the choices people make when they inherit fortunes built on death. The Winchester Mystery House has survived fires, earthquakes, economic depressions, wars, and nearly a century of commercial operation. The structure Sarah built has proven more durable than anyone expected. Whether it will last another century depends on continued tourist interest, adequate maintenance funding, and decisions made by current and future owners about how to balance history, entertainment, and profit. The house is not just building, it is business, historical site, tourist attraction, and ongoing question about what we choose to remember and how we choose to remember it. So what do you build when you know the ground beneath your castle has always been contested? When the fortune funding every board and nail came from death on industrial scale? When the beauty you create depends on labor you render invisible? When 38 years of construction can never answer the question that drove you to build in the first place? Sarah Winchester built the only thing she could, something that would outlast her and remain inexplicable. The house resists simple interpretation because Sarah's situation resisted simple resolution. She inherited wealth she did not earn, from an industry she did not control, that killed people she would never know. The moral arithmetic had no solution. No amount of building could unkill those who died by Winchester rifles. No architectural gesture could restore buffalo herds or indigenous lands. The guilt, if that's what she felt, was permanent. The only choice was what to do with days that stretched forward regardless. She chose construction, perpetual, pointless, obsessive construction. And in that choice, something unexpected emerged: employment. For nearly 4 decades, the Winchester Mystery House provided steady work for carpenters, masons, glaziers, gardeners, housekeepers, cooks, stable hands. Hundreds of people earned livings from Sarah's obsession. The money that came from death got transformed into wages for families who needed them. This was not Sarah's stated goal. She was not consciously running a jobs program, but it was the effect. Blood money became paychecks. Weapons profits became middle-class stability for workers who otherwise might have struggled. This does not absolve the original sin. The Winchester rifle killed. The company profited from killing. Sarah's dividends derived from that profit. No amount of generous employment policies changes that foundation, but it complicates the narrative. Sarah did not simply hoard her fortune or spend it on personal luxury. She poured it into a project that benefited others, even if the benefit was accidental byproduct rather than primary purpose. The house is both monument to grief and generator of livelihoods. Both things are true.
The invisibility of labor is architectural and historical. Sarah designed the house so she never had to see the people who made her comfort possible. Service corridors, separate stairs, below-stairs worlds where workers moved unseen. This was standard for Gilded Age mansions, not unique to Sarah. But it was deliberate. The house enforced separation, maintained hierarchy, rendered labor invisible so luxury could appear effortless. That choice had costs. The workers who built and maintained the house largely disappeared from the historical record. We know job titles and approximate wages. We rarely know names, stories, thoughts. They were erased not just from Sarah's daily view, but from historical memory. Yet some survived to tell limited stories. Workers who spent years at the house left accounts describing Sarah as demanding but fair, eccentric but not cruel. She paid well. She provided steady work. She did not engage in the casual cruelty common among wealthy employers. By Gilded Age standards, she was a decent mistress. But kindness within an exploitative system is still participation in that system. A gentle mistress is still a mistress. Better treatment does not erase fundamental power imbalance. Sarah controlled wages, hours, employment, housing. Workers had only the power to quit and find other work, which in early 1900s California was not a simple proposition. The house reveals how wealth actually operates. Not through individual moral choices. Sarah was not particularly cruel or particularly kind by her era's standards, but through structural power. She could build for 38 years because Winchester dividends kept flowing. Those dividends came from weapons sales. Those sales depended on American expansion, military conflicts, and systems of violence that predated Sarah and extended far beyond her. She was not architect of these systems. She was heir and beneficiary, and she spent her inheritance in ways that were strange, but arguably more ethical than most alternatives available to wealthy women in her position. What Sarah could not do was refuse the fortune entirely. Rejecting inheritance would impoverish her, but not unkill anyone. The damage was done. The rifles existed. The deaths had occurred. The only choice was what to do with the wealth that resulted. Sarah chose building. Others in her position chose yachts, jewels, European estates, political influence. Sarah chose hammering. It was a bizarre choice, but it was a choice that employed people and created something that still stands.
The question of whether it was worth it cannot be answered cleanly. Worth it to whom? For what purpose? The house cost millions and accomplished nothing practical. It does not house a dynasty. It does not generate income beyond tourism that trades on its strangeness. It does not advance architectural knowledge. The floor plan is cautionary tale, not model. But it employed hundreds during its construction. It provides employment now for tour guides and maintenance staff. It generates economic activity in San Jose. It gives thousands of tourists annually a few hours of fascination and strangeness. Are these outcomes worth $5.5 million 1920s dollars? The question assumes value has single measure. It does not. The house is evidence of what Gilded Age wealth permitted. Decades of construction without endpoint, resources consumed without accounting, labor employed without contract clarity. It is evidence of what grief and guilt can do when combined with fortune and freedom from social constraint. It is evidence that women with wealth could exercise agency in ways that defied social expectations, even if that agency produced results that made no sense to others. Sarah built because she could, because she chose to, because the alternative was sitting in wealth doing nothing while knowing where that wealth came from. The spirits, if they existed, were not supernatural. They were the thousands killed by Winchester rifles. They haunted not because they were ghosts, but because they were history. Their deaths created the fortune. Their absence made Sarah's wealth possible. Whether Sarah believed in literal spirits or simply understood metaphorical haunting, the result was the same. A life spent building something that could never be finished because the guilt that drove it could never be resolved. You cannot outbuild complicity. You cannot construct your way to innocence, but you can spend your fortune employing people instead of hoarding it. You can build strange beauty instead of conventional monuments. You can choose motion over stasis, action over paralysis, even if the action never answers the underlying question. The Winchester Mystery House stands as a reminder that moral questions sometimes have no solutions, only choices about how to live with irresolvable guilt. Sarah chose poorly by some measures, obsessively by others, and generously by a few. She was not hero, she was not villain. She was a human being with too much money, too much grief, and no good options. She built. The house stands. The question remains.
The Winchester Mystery House is located at 525 South Winchester Boulevard in San Jose, California. You can tour it today. Standard tours cost approximately $50, take about an hour, and show you perhaps 30 rooms. You will see staircases to nowhere, doors opening onto walls, beautiful Tiffany windows, elaborate woodwork. Your tour guide will tell you about Sarah's seances, her fear of ghosts, her building obsession. What they will not tell you, or will mention only in passing, is where the money came from. The Winchester rifle, the gun that won the West, the weapon that killed hundreds of thousands. The official narrative has shifted slightly in recent years. Some tours now acknowledge that Sarah may have been processing grief and guilt rather than literally communicating with spirits. Academic research gets incorporated into tourist experience, though simplified. The house is presented as both mysterious and understandable, both inexplicable and rational, depending on which interpretation visitors prefer. The ambiguity is marketable. People can believe what they want and still enjoy the tour. The questions the house raises are not answered by the tours. They are not meant to be. Was Sarah mentally ill, or was she a rational woman responding to impossible situation? Did she truly believe in spirits, or was spiritualism a framework for coping with grief? Was the construction therapy, penance, madness, or simply way to fill time? The evidence supports multiple interpretations and resolves none definitively. Sarah left no detailed explanation. She gave no interviews, she wrote no memoir. The house is her only statement, and it speaks in riddles. What the house makes undeniably clear, wealth permits behavior that would be impossible otherwise. Sarah built for 38 years because she had money to build. No financial constraints forced her to stop or modify her vision. No family obligations demanded she serve dynastic purposes. No social pressures compelled her to conform. She was a wealthy widow with agency unusual for her era, and she used that agency to build something no one else would or could have built. The result is strange, beautiful, disturbing, and entirely hers. The workers who made it possible are mostly forgotten. Some names survive in payroll records: John Hanson, the foreman; Henrietta Sivers, the housekeeper. Others are anonymous: the carpenter who laid parquet floors, the glazier who installed Tiffany windows, the gardener who maintained roses, the cook who prepared meals, the maid who cleaned fireplaces every morning before dawn. Their labor is visible in every room, but their stories are lost. They built Sarah's vision and disappeared into history, leaving behind craftsmanship and wage figures, but not voices or faces.
This is how Gilded Age properties are remembered. The owners get names, stories, psychological profiles. The workers get occasional mention as labor statistics. The pattern repeats across Vanderbilt estates, Rockefeller compounds, Carnegie mansions. We know what the wealthy thought and felt. They left letters, diaries, interviews. We know far less about the people who served them, who rarely had time or education to write, whose private thoughts were not considered worth preserving. The Winchester Mystery House perpetuates this pattern. Sarah's story is told and retold. The workers' stories are mostly untold. Was it worth it? Who benefited? Who paid? What was the true cost? Could it have been different? Should it have been? These questions do not have clean answers. Sarah spent a fortune employing people rather than hoarding wealth. That seems better than alternatives. But the fortune came from death. That seems inescapable. She built beauty. That seems valuable. But she built absurdity. That seems wasteful. She processed grief through architecture. That seems human, but she did so at scale that was only possible through inherited privilege. That seems unequal. The house demands that visitors hold multiple truths simultaneously. It was magnificent obsession and massive waste. It was therapeutic building and pointless spending. It was generous employment and exploitation of labor. It was woman's exercise of agency and wealthy person's indulgence. It was architectural experiment and incoherent mess. All of these are true. None cancels the others out. The tour ends in the gift shop, which is fitting. The house that Sarah built to process grief now sells coffee mugs, t-shirts, and postcards. The place she intended as private retreat is public attraction. The mystery she never explained is marketed as entertainment. This transformation was necessary for the house to survive. No one could maintain it as private residence after Sarah died. But the transformation changes meaning. What was personal becomes commercial. What was inexplicable becomes commodity. Stand in the séance room today, if your tour includes it. Midnight blue walls, single entrance, 13 hooks in the cabinet. The guide will explain that Sarah held nightly sessions here, communicating with spirits who told her where to build. Maybe she did. Maybe she sat here in silence, processing grief no amount of conversation could resolve. Maybe she simply liked the room's quiet and claimed spiritual purpose to justify her privacy. You will never know. Neither will anyone else. Sarah took her true motivations to her grave. Walk through the grand ballroom. Look at the parquet floors that cost thousands per square foot. Admire the Tiffany windows, the carved woodwork, the attention to detail. Then remember, the money that paid for this came from weapons. Every beautiful thing in this house was purchased with profit from death. That does not make the beauty less real, but it complicates the beauty. It forces reckoning with how wealth accumulated in Gilded Age America and whose labor and whose suffering enabled that accumulation. The house is a mirror. What we see in it depends on what we bring to it and how closely we look. If we look only at surface, we see haunted mansion, Gothic curiosity, eccentric widow's folly. If we look deeper, we see grief, guilt, moral complexity, systemic violence, labor exploitation, and woman's struggle to live with fortune she never asked for that came from death she could not prevent. Both views are accurate. Neither is complete. Buildings do not choose their owners or their purposes. People do. Sarah Winchester chose to inherit the fortune. She could not have refused it without impoverishing herself, which would have changed nothing about how the money was earned. She chose to build. She could have spent the fortune otherwise, on conventional luxuries or charitable ventures. She chose 38 years of construction. She could have stopped at any point. She chose not to. Those choices created the house. The house created employment. The employment supported families. The families contributed to San Jose's economy. The economy grew. The city expanded. And now, a century later, tourists drive past suburban sprawl to see the architectural oddity that widow built with rifle money in what was once orchard land. The chain of causation is long and complex. The moral accounting is impossible.
The house stands.
The hammering stopped September 5th, 1922, when Sarah's heart stopped. The house will stand longer than that. Wood rots, but slowly. Foundations shift, but gradually. With maintenance and care and continued tourist revenue, the Winchester Mystery House could stand another century or more. It will outlast everyone currently alive. It will outlast the memory of Sarah Winchester beyond historical records and tourist narratives. It will outlast the contexts that made it comprehensible to its creator. What remains is the thing itself. Walls, rooms, stairs, doors, windows, architecture that defies explanation but demands attention. A woman built this, with money from death, for reasons she never fully explained. Workers made it real, with skill and labor history has largely forgotten. Tourists visit it now, finding fascination without understanding, entertainment without resolution, strangeness that persists across a century. The house is what Sarah made it, inexplicable, incomplete, and enduring. The question is what people will choose to do with what they see when they look at it. The answer, like so much else, depends on whether they're willing to look closely or simply consume the mystery.